My name is Joaquin Rivera, and I'm a pilot who survived the first 90 days of the Ice Age apocalypse. When Yellowstone erupted 3 months ago, I watched civilization collapse as temperatures dropped 40 degrees and stayed there. Now I'm stranded in a frozen McDonald's in Texas, 350 miles from my family in San Antonio, with a plane that might never fly again. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Joaquin Rivera, and I'm a pilot who survived the first 90 days of the Ice Age apocalypse. When Yellowstone erupted 3 months ago, I watched civilization collapse as temperatures dropped 40 degrees and stayed there. Now I'm stranded in a frozen McDonald's in Texas, 350 miles from my family in San Antonio, with a plane that might never fly again. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. What I'm about to tell you happened fast. 7 days to go from normal life to complete societal breakdown. 7 days for the temperature to drop 40 degrees and stay there. I'm recording this message because someone needs to document what really happened during those first weeks when the world ended not with bombs or invasions, but with ash and ice, and the terrifying realization that everything we built was more fragile than we ever imagined. 3 months ago, I was complaining about delayed flights and bad airport coffee. I flew supply runs for Southwest Airlines, mostly short hops between Denver and Phoenix, carrying everything from medical supplies to spare parts for oil rigs. It was routine work, the kind of flying that pays the bills but doesn't exactly set your soul on fire. I'd wake up at 5 in the morning, drive to Denver International, do my pre-flight checks, and spend the day moving cargo from one city to another. Simple, predictable, safe. October 15th, 2024 started like any other Tuesday. I remember because I'd been looking forward to getting home early for once. My Cherokee was loaded with hydraulic components bound for a drilling operation outside Phoenix, nothing unusual. The manifest said 3,000 pounds of equipment, well within my aircraft's limits. Weather looked clear all the way to Arizona, winds were light, and I'd filed a flight plan that would have me back in Denver by 6 in the evening. But that morning, something felt off. I've been flying for 15 years, and you develop instincts about these things. During my pre-flight check at Phoenix Sky Harbor, the birds were too quiet. You know how airports usually have flocks of birds around the perimeter, making noise, fighting over scraps from the restaurants. That morning, nothing. The sky had this weird hazy quality too, like dust was hanging in the air, but the weather report said clear skies with unlimited visibility. I should have paid more attention to those signs. In aviation, we're trained to notice anomalies, to question anything that doesn't feel right. But I was focused on getting home, on maintaining my schedule, on all the mundane concerns that seemed so important then and mean absolutely nothing now. The flight north was smooth. I cruised at 8,000 feet, watching the familiar landscape of the American Southwest roll by below. The Colorado River snaking through the desert, the scattered communities connected by thin ribbons of highway, the vast empty spaces that most people never see except from 30,000 feet on a commercial airliner. I'd flown this route hundreds of times, and it looked exactly the same as always. No signs that in a few hours everything would change forever. I landed at Denver International at 2:15 in the afternoon, 15 minutes ahead of schedule. The touchdown was smooth, the taxi to the cargo ramp routine. I shut down the engine, completed my post-flight paperwork, and was looking forward to grabbing a sandwich before heading home. That's when the ground started shaking. At first, I thought it was just another aircraft taxiing nearby. Denver International is a busy airport, and you get used to the rumble of heavy jets moving around. But this was different, deeper, more sustained. It made the coffee in my thermos ripple like we were experiencing an earthquake, which didn't make sense because Colorado isn't exactly known for seismic activity. I climbed out of my Cherokee and looked around. Other pilots and ground crew were doing the same thing, all of us trying to figure out what was causing that strange vibration. Then someone pointed at the terminal windows, where crowds of people were gathering around the television screens, their faces lit by that familiar blue glow of breaking news. I walked toward the terminal, my flight bag still slung over my shoulder. The automatic doors seemed to struggle against an increasing wind that hadn't been there when I landed. Inside, hundreds of passengers and airport workers stood transfixed by the screens showing satellite footage that looked like something from a disaster movie. A massive black column was rising from Wyoming, stretching so high into the atmosphere that it disappeared beyond the satellite's view. The CNN anchor was struggling to maintain her usual professional composure. Her voice had that slight tremor that news people get when they're reporting something truly catastrophic. She kept saying volcanic eruption and Yellowstone caldera and catastrophic event, but I could tell from her expression that even she didn't fully understand what she was looking at. The eruption had begun at 2:47 Mountain Time, she reported, just 32 minutes earlier. The initial blast had ejected an estimated 500 cubic kilometers of ash into the atmosphere, making it one of the largest volcanic events in recorded history. Scientists were calling it a super eruption, the kind that happens maybe once every 100,000 years. I stood there with everyone else, watching those satellite images, and I remember thinking how unreal it all seemed. The numbers were too big to comprehend. 500 cubic kilometers of ash, a column reaching 30 miles into the stratosphere, seismic readings that had broken measuring equipment across 3 states. It was like watching footage from another planet. But what really got my attention were the wind patterns they were showing. The jet stream was already starting to carry that ash cloud eastward, spreading it across the entire continent. Within hours, they said, the ash would reach the east coast. Within days, it would circle the globe. The meteorologist kept using phrases like nuclear winter scenario and significant climate impact, but I could tell he was trying not to panic anyone. That first night, sleeping in an airport hotel because all flights had been grounded indefinitely, I called my sister Maria in San Antonio. She sounded worried, which wasn't like her. Maria had always been the calm one in our family, the one who could handle any crisis with a smile and a plan. But that night, her voice had an edge I'd never heard before. She told me that even in Texas, they were seeing strange weather patterns. Unseasonably cold winds from the north, unusual cloud formations, temperatures dropping faster than any October weather system she could remember. Her kids were complaining about the strange smell in the air, like sulfur mixed with dust. The local news in San Antonio was downplaying everything, calling it a temporary atmospheric disturbance, but Maria wasn't buying it. I tried to reassure her, told her I'd be home as soon as the flight restrictions were lifted. But privately, I was starting to do the calculations that would eventually save my life. How much fuel did I have access to? How far could my Cherokee fly on a full tank? How long could I wait before aviation fuel became impossible to find? The second day, October 16th, the ash started falling in Denver. Not the heavy chunks you might expect from a volcano, but fine particles that hung in the air like fog and coated everything with a gray film that tasted metallic when you breathed it in. The airport issued masks to everyone, the kind construction workers use, and recommended that people stay indoors as much as possible. By then, the television coverage had shifted from amazement to genuine concern. Scientists from around the world were being interviewed via satellite, and their message was becoming increasingly urgent. This wasn't just a spectacular natural event. This was a global climate catastrophe in the making. The ash in the atmosphere was already measurably reducing the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth's surface. They kept mentioning 1816, the year without a summer, when a much smaller volcanic eruption in Indonesia had caused crop failures and famine across Europe and North America. But this eruption was orders of magnitude larger, and it was happening during a solar minimum, a period when the sun's energy output was already at its lowest point in decades. The combination, they said, could trigger a volcanic winter lasting years. I started paying closer attention to the technical details they were discussing. The ash was reaching altitudes where it would take years to settle out of the atmosphere. The sulfur compounds were forming aerosols that would reflect sunlight back into space. Global temperatures could drop by several degrees Celsius, enough to devastate agriculture and trigger massive social disruption. But the government response was still focused on calm and reassurance. FEMA was mobilizing resources. The National Guard was being deployed to assist with ash cleanup. Emergency food distributions were being organized. Officials kept emphasizing that this was a temporary situation, that America had weathered natural disasters before and would weather this one too. On October 18th, it started snowing in Denver. Not the light dusting you might see in early winter, but thick, heavy flakes that fell continuously for 6 straight days. By October 24th, the snowdrifts were higher than cars. The temperature had dropped from a normal October high of 65 degrees to a constant 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and it showed no signs of rising. That's when I knew the officials were lying to themselves as much as to us. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't going to be fixed by emergency response teams and food distributions. This was permanent climate change happening in real time, and most people still hadn't grasped the implications. The airport became a strange kind of refugee camp. Thousands of passengers were stranded there, sleeping on benches and floors, sharing rapidly dwindling food supplies from the restaurants and gift shops. The heating system was struggling to keep up with the unprecedented cold, and parts of the terminal were becoming uninhabitable. I spent those days maintaining my Cherokee, keeping the engine warm, checking and double-checking my fuel supplies. Other pilots were doing the same thing, but I could see the desperation in their eyes. Most of them flew jets that needed specialized fuel and support equipment. My single-engine aircraft was primitive by comparison, but that primitiveness was becoming an advantage. Aviation fuel was already becoming scarce. The refineries that produced it were dealing with their own weather-related problems, and the distribution system was breaking down as roads became impassable. I started hoarding every gallon I could get my hands on, storing it in containers I found around the airport, calculating and recalculating how far it might take me. By the end of October, I was monitoring emergency radio frequencies, listening to reports from around the country. The news was uniformly bad. Chicago was reporting record low temperatures and widespread power outages. New York had received over 3 feet of snow. Agricultural regions across the Midwest were experiencing killing frosts that were destroying crops that should have been harvested weeks earlier. The most disturbing reports were coming from the northern tier states. Minneapolis had recorded temperatures of -10 degrees Fahrenheit in late October, something that had never happened before in recorded history. Seattle was dealing with unprecedented snowfall that was collapsing roofs and shutting down all transportation. Even places like Nashville and Atlanta were seeing snow accumulations measured in feet rather than inches. Maria called me again on November 1st, and this time I could hear the fear in her voice that she was trying to hide. The temperature in San Antonio had dropped to 30 degrees, and her heating bill for October had been 3 times higher than normal. She was starting to ration the heating oil for her house, trying to keep warm air in just the bedrooms where she and her kids slept. More importantly, she told me that the grocery stores in San Antonio were starting to have supply problems. Fresh produce was becoming scarce and expensive. Canned goods were flying off the shelves. People were stockpiling food like they were preparing for a hurricane that might last months instead of days. I tried to tell her I was planning to fly south as soon as conditions improved, but we both knew that conditions weren't improving. They were getting worse every day. The ash was still falling. The temperatures were still dropping. and the snow that had started in Denver was now falling as far south as Oklahoma. November 2nd, the power went out at Denver International. Not rolling blackouts or temporary outages, but complete system failure. Ice was pulling down power lines faster than repair crews could fix them, and the crews had stopped coming anyway. The few generators that were still running were reserved for essential services, which apparently didn't include keeping passengers warm. That night, sleeping in my aircraft to stay warm, I made the decision that would determine whether I lived or died. I was going to fly south while I still could. I was going to load every supply I could carry, file a flight plan for San Antonio, and hope that 800 miles of frozen landscape wouldn't kill me before I could reach my family. The next morning, November 3rd, I started my final preparations. I drained water from every system in my aircraft and replaced it with antifreeze. I loaded emergency food supplies, survival gear, extra clothing, medical supplies, anything that might keep me alive if I had to make an emergency landing in the middle of nowhere. I also started saying goodbye, though I didn't tell anyone that's what I was doing. There were people at that airport who had become friends during our shared exile, fellow pilots who had helped me maintain my aircraft, passengers who had shared their food when supplies ran low, airport workers who had kept essential services running even as their own world collapsed around them. But I knew that if I waited much longer, I'd be saying goodbye permanently. The fuel supplies were almost exhausted. The weather was getting worse every day. And most critically, the radio reports from the south were becoming increasingly desperate. If Texas was starting to freeze, there might not be anywhere warm enough to sustain life. On November 5th, I did my final pre-flight inspection. The Cherokee looked tired, covered with ash and ice, but her engine turned over cleanly and all her systems checked out. I had enough fuel for maybe 800 miles if I flew efficiently and didn't encounter headwinds. San Antonio was 900 miles away. I filed a flight plan with what remained of air traffic control, though I wasn't sure anyone was still monitoring the frequencies. I loaded my survival gear and emergency supplies. I said my last goodbyes to the people who had become my temporary family during those 3 weeks of disaster. And then I waited for dawn, because I wanted to take off in daylight, when I could see the terrain below and avoid the worst of the weather. I knew this might be the last time my Cherokee ever flew. I knew I might be flying to my own funeral. But I also knew that staying in Denver meant certain death, while flying south at least offered the possibility of reaching my family before the world finished ending. As I sat in that frozen cockpit, watching the sun rise over a landscape that no longer looked like America, I started doing the final calculations that every pilot makes before a dangerous flight. Fuel consumption rates, weather conditions, alternative landing sites. The mathematics of survival reduced to gallons of fuel and miles of frozen ground. What I couldn't calculate was whether my sister and her children were still alive, whether San Antonio still existed as anything more than another frozen city full of abandoned buildings, whether I was flying toward salvation or just choosing a different place to die. But I was going to find out, because that's what pilots do. We navigate through the storm and find a way home, even when we're not sure there's still a home to find. If you watched my first recording, you know how fast things fell apart in the first week after Yellowstone erupted. What I'm about to tell you is how civilization died in the next 3 weeks. How a country that had survived world wars and economic collapses and natural disasters simply stopped functioning when the temperature dropped 40 degrees and stayed there. I was still at Denver International Airport during those crucial weeks in early November, watching from the inside as everything we took for granted just disappeared. The power grid, the supply chains, the communication networks, the basic infrastructure that keeps 300 million people alive. It all went away faster than anyone thought possible. November 1st was the day the lights went out for good. Not rolling blackouts or temporary power outages, but complete system failure across the entire Denver metropolitan area. I watched it happen from the terminal windows as section after section of the city went dark. The utility crews had been working around the clock for 2 weeks, trying to repair lines that ice was pulling down faster than they could fix them. But that morning, they just stopped coming. The trucks stopped rolling. The repair crews stopped climbing poles. Because when the temperature hits -15 degrees in early November and stays there for days, you reach a point where the infrastructure can't be maintained anymore. The equipment fails. The workers can't function. And society starts to break down at the most basic level. The airport generators kept running for another 12 hours, powering the essential systems and keeping some heat in the terminal. But by midnight, even those had failed. The fuel trucks that should have been refilling them were stuck on highways that had become impassable sheets of ice. The maintenance crews that should have been servicing them were either dead or had abandoned their posts to try to keep their own families alive. That night, sleeping in my Cherokee to stay warm, I could hear the airport dying around me. The hum of ventilation systems going quiet. The last of the automated announcements cutting off mid-sentence. The emergency lighting flickering out section by section, until the entire terminal was dark except for the scattered fires that people had started using furniture and debris from the gift shops. By November 5th, Denver International Airport had become something between a refugee camp and a morgue. There were maybe 3,000 people still there, down from the 15,000 who had been stranded when the eruption first shut down air travel. Some had tried to leave on foot, walking south on highways that were buried under snow. Others had simply died from the cold or from medical conditions that couldn't be treated without power or supplies. The few of us who remained had formed survival groups, sharing resources and body heat and the grim knowledge that we were probably going to die there. The airport restaurants had been picked clean weeks earlier. We were melting snow for drinking water and burning anything that would combust to stay warm. The temperature inside the terminal was maybe 20 degrees warmer than outside, which meant it was still cold enough to kill you if you fell asleep in the wrong place. I kept my Cherokee in a heated hangar, running the engine for 30 minutes every morning to keep the oil from freezing solid. Aviation fuel was becoming more precious than gold, but I had managed to hoard about 60 gallons in various containers scattered around the airport. Enough for maybe one flight to somewhere warmer, if anywhere warmer still existed. The radio was our only connection to the outside world, and the news it brought was uniformly terrible. Ham radio operators across the country were reporting conditions that sounded like something from a science fiction movie. Chicago had recorded temperatures of -25 degrees. Minneapolis was completely cut off, with snowdrifts covering second-story windows. Even cities as far south as Oklahoma City were reporting temperatures that would have been unusual in January, let alone November. But the most disturbing reports were about the mass migration that had started across the entire northern half of the country. Millions of people were abandoning their homes and trying to move south, creating refugee streams that stretched for hundreds of miles along every major highway. Most of them were traveling on foot because the roads were too dangerous for vehicles and fuel was becoming impossible to find. I monitored the emergency frequencies constantly, listening to desperate voices calling for help that wasn't coming. State governments had collapsed or retreated to emergency bunkers. The federal government was still broadcasting official statements about relief efforts and emergency aid, but anyone with a radio could tell that those were just words. The actual government response had stopped when the people running it had to choose between doing their jobs and keeping their own families alive. Maria called me one last time on November 8th, using a ham radio setup that one of her neighbors had cobbled together from spare parts. The phone networks had been down for days, and this was the first contact I'd had with her since the power went out. Her voice sounded smaller somehow, like she was speaking from very far away. She told me that the temperature in San Antonio had dropped to 15 degrees, something that had never happened in the recorded history of Texas. Her heating oil was almost gone, and she was keeping warm by burning furniture in her fireplace. The grocery stores had been empty for over a week. She and her kids were surviving on canned goods and whatever food she had managed to stockpile before the panic buying started. But what really scared me was what she said about the refugees. Thousands of people were streaming into San Antonio from the north, people who had abandoned everything and were walking hundreds of miles looking for somewhere warm enough to survive. The city couldn't handle that many displaced people. There wasn't enough food, enough shelter, enough medical care. Violence was starting to break out as resources became scarce and desperation set in. She asked me when I was coming, and I couldn't give her an answer. I wanted to tell her I was leaving the next day, that I'd be there in a few hours, that everything was going to be fine. But I knew that taking off in those conditions was probably suicide. The weather reports, what few were still being broadcast, showed storms stretching from Colorado to Texas. Ice storms that would bring down any aircraft foolish enough to fly through them. That conversation was the last time I ever heard my sister's voice. The radio connection started breaking up about 10 minutes in, and then it cut out completely. I tried calling back on the same frequency for hours, but got nothing except static. Either her radio had failed, or the atmospheric conditions had changed, or something worse had happened that she couldn't respond to anymore. November 10th, I made a decision that probably saved my life. I stopped thinking of myself as a pilot waiting for conditions to improve and started thinking of myself as a survivor who happened to have access to an aircraft. Instead of planning a normal flight with standard procedures and safety margins, I started planning a desperate escape attempt that might kill me, but was better than the certain death of staying in Denver. I began modifying my Cherokee for cold weather survival. I ripped out every unnecessary piece of equipment to save weight and make room for supplies. I installed additional fuel tanks in the cabin, giving me maybe 200 extra miles of range. I packed survival gear, medical supplies, emergency food, anything that might keep me alive if I had to make a forced landing in the middle of the frozen wasteland that America had become. More importantly, I started studying weather patterns and looking for windows of opportunity. The storm systems were huge and slow-moving, but they weren't continuous. There were gaps, brief periods when the weather might be just good enough for a small aircraft to squeeze through. I needed maybe 6 hours of flyable weather to reach San Antonio. 6 hours when the ice storms weren't active and the winds weren't too strong, and the visibility was good enough for navigation. By mid-November, the situation at the airport had become genuinely dangerous. Food was almost completely gone. People were starting to fight over the remaining supplies. Some of the survival groups had turned into gangs, taking what they needed from anyone too weak to defend themselves. I had started sleeping in my aircraft with the doors locked, because I knew that anyone desperate enough might try to take my plane and leave me stranded. The breaking point came on November 18th, when a group of passengers tried to rush the hangar where I kept my Cherokee. They had figured out that I had fuel and supplies, and they wanted to force me to fly them south. There were maybe 15 of them, including some airport workers who knew how to get past the security doors. I managed to get the engine started and taxi out of the hangar before they could stop me, but it was close. As I rolled toward the runway, I could see them running after the aircraft, shouting and gesturing for me to stop. Some of them had children with them, families who were probably going to die if they stayed at the airport much longer. But I also knew that my Cherokee could only carry 4 people, including myself, and trying to overload it would probably kill all of us. I had to make the hardest decision of my life, choosing between helping people who were going to die anyway and preserving my own chance of reaching my family. I chose my family, and I've been living with that guilt ever since. That incident convinced me that I couldn't wait any longer for perfect conditions. The weather might never improve, and every day I delayed increased the chance that someone would try to take my aircraft or that some critical component would fail in the cold. I needed to leave while I still could, even if the odds of survival were minimal. November 20th, I got my chance. A high-pressure system was moving in from the west, promising at least temporary clearing of the storm clouds that had been dumping snow and ice across the entire region. The ham radio weather reports suggested that I might have a 6-hour window of relatively calm conditions, starting around dawn the next morning. I spent that night doing final preparations. I drained every water system in my aircraft and replaced the fluids with antifreeze. I loaded my survival gear and emergency supplies. I studied the route one more time, identifying every possible landing site between Denver and San Antonio in case something went wrong. Most importantly, I said goodbye to the people who had helped me survive those 3 weeks of disaster. Fellow pilots who had shared their technical knowledge, passengers who had helped me find supplies and equipment, airport workers who had kept essential services running even as their own world collapsed around them. But I didn't tell anyone I was leaving. I couldn't risk another confrontation like the one that had almost cost me my aircraft. I just shook hands and thanked people for their help, as if I were planning to see them again the next day. November 21st, I woke up at 4 in the morning to begin my pre-flight inspection. The Cherokee looked tired, covered with ice and ash, but her engine turned over smoothly and all the systems checked out. The outside temperature was negative 12 degrees, cold enough that I had to be careful not to touch metal surfaces with bare skin. I loaded the last of my supplies and secured everything for flight. I had calculated my fuel consumption down to the gallon, planning a route that would take me directly over the Texas Panhandle and into San Antonio with maybe 30 minutes of reserve fuel. No margin for error, no allowance for headwinds or navigation mistakes. At dawn, I taxied to the runway and did my final engine run-up. Everything looked good. The weather was clear for the first time in weeks, with unlimited visibility and light winds. If I was ever going to make this flight, this was the time. As I lined up for takeoff, I could see people coming out of the terminal to watch. Word had somehow gotten around that someone was attempting to fly south, and they wanted to witness either a successful escape or a spectacular failure. I didn't wave or acknowledge them. I just pushed the throttle forward and started my takeoff roll. The Cherokee lifted off smoothly despite the cold air and heavy load. As I climbed away from Denver International, I looked down at what had been one of the busiest airports in America just a month earlier. Now it looked like an abandoned outpost on an alien planet, dark and silent except for a few scattered fires and the tiny figures of people who would probably never leave. I turned south and began the most dangerous flight of my life. 800 miles of frozen landscape lay between me and my family. The fuel gauge showed full, but I knew that would change quickly in the dense cold air. The engine was running smoothly, but aircraft engines aren't designed to operate at these temperatures for extended periods. Most critically, I had no idea what I would find when I reached San Antonio. The radio reports from Texas had been getting worse every day. For all I knew, I was flying toward a city that was as dead and frozen as the one I was leaving behind. But I was committed now. The runway at Denver was already disappearing behind me, and I didn't have enough fuel to turn back. I was going to find out whether Texas still offered hope for survival, or whether the ice age that had started in Wyoming was going to kill me somewhere over the empty plains of New Mexico. As I settled into cruise flight at 8,000 feet, watching the frozen Colorado landscape pass below, I started thinking about what I would tell Maria when I saw her again. How do you explain that it took you a month to travel 900 miles? How do you describe watching an entire civilization collapse in real time? How do you prepare someone for the possibility that spring might never come again? The radio was quiet except for occasional bursts of static and the desperate voices of other survivors calling for help that would never arrive. I flew south through skies that should have been full of commercial traffic, but were now empty, except for the occasional military aircraft heading toward disasters that couldn't be fixed. Behind me, Denver disappeared into the haze and distance. Ahead of me lay hundreds of miles of uncertainty and the slim hope that somewhere in Texas, my family was still alive and waiting for their pilot to finally come home. From 8,000 feet, you see things differently than you do from the ground. What I saw flying south from Denver that November morning was the skeleton of a dead country. The landscape that had once been the heart of American agriculture was now an endless expanse of white, broken only by the dark lines of rivers that had frozen solid, and the scattered geometric patterns of towns that no longer showed any signs of life. I'd flown this route hundreds of times over the years, carrying cargo between Denver and Phoenix, and I knew every landmark below. The Arkansas River should have been flowing freely through southeastern Colorado. Instead, it looked like a highway made of ice, stretching from the mountains all the way to the Kansas border. I'd never seen anything like it, not even during the worst winters on record. Colorado Springs passed below my left wing, a city of 500,000 people that now looked like a collection of snow-covered mounds. There were no lights visible even though it was still early morning. No smoke from chimneys. No movement on the streets. The only signs of recent human activity were scattered dark spots that I realized were fires that had burned themselves out, probably people trying to stay warm by burning whatever they could find. My Cherokee was running smoothly despite the cold, but I could tell the engine was working harder than normal. The dense air at these low temperatures was putting extra strain on everything, from the fuel system to the electrical components. I was burning fuel faster than my calculations had predicted, and I started doing revised math in my head about whether I had enough range to reach San Antonio. The radio was mostly quiet, just occasional bursts of static, and the faint voices of ham radio operators trying to maintain contact across the disaster zone. Every few minutes, I'd hear someone calling for help or asking for information about conditions in various cities. The responses, when they came at all, were uniformly bad. Roads impassable, power out, communication systems down, supplies exhausted. About an hour into the flight, as I crossed into New Mexico airspace, I started picking up transmissions from what sounded like a military frequency. The voices were professional and calm, but the content was terrifying. They were coordinating relief flights to major cities, but the reports they were getting back painted a picture of complete social collapse. One pilot was reporting from Kansas City that the airport was unusable due to ice damage and that there were no ground services available. Another was describing conditions in Oklahoma City as catastrophic, with widespread fires and no functioning emergency services. A third was requesting permission to abort his mission to Little Rock because the entire city appeared to be abandoned. These were military pilots with access to specialized cold weather equipment and unlimited fuel supplies, and they were turning back from missions that had become too dangerous to complete. If they couldn't operate safely in these conditions, what chance did I have in my single-engine civilian aircraft? But I kept flying south, because turning back meant certain death and going forward at least offered the possibility of reaching my family. I climbed to 10,000 feet to try to get above some of the turbulence, but even at that altitude, the air was rough and unpredictable. Ice was starting to form on my wings despite the anti-icing equipment, adding weight and reducing lift. The landscape below was becoming increasingly alien. Towns that should have been thriving communities were buried under snow drifts that made them look like geological formations rather than human settlements. Highways that should have been busy with traffic were empty, except for the occasional dark spot that was probably an abandoned vehicle. Near the Texas border, I started seeing signs of the mass migration that Maria had described during our last radio conversation. Long lines of tiny figures moving south along the interstate highways, too small to make out individual people, but clearly representing thousands of refugees walking toward what they hoped would be warmer territory. Some of these refugee streams stretch for miles, dark threads against the white landscape that marked the desperate movement of people who had abandoned everything to try to reach someplace where they might survive. I knew that most of them would never make it. Walking hundreds of miles in sub-zero temperatures without adequate food or shelter was essentially a death sentence. But I also knew they didn't have any choice. The northern cities had become uninhabitable. The infrastructure had collapsed. The supply chains had broken down. These people were walking south because staying where they were meant freezing to death in their own homes. Flying over the Texas Panhandle, I expected to see some improvement in conditions, some sign that the extreme cold hadn't penetrated this far south. Instead, the landscape looked just as frozen and lifeless as everything I'd seen in Colorado and New Mexico. Amarillo, which should have been a functioning city with a population of 200,000, looked dark and abandoned from the air. That's when I started having serious doubts about my mission. If the freeze had reached this far south, if even Texas was becoming uninhabitable, then maybe I was just flying toward a different place to die. Maybe San Antonio was as frozen and empty as Denver, and I was wasting my remaining fuel to arrive at a disaster zone instead of a safe haven. But I couldn't turn back now. I was already past the point of no return, with barely enough fuel to reach my destination and no margin for extended flight time. I had committed to this course of action, and I was going to see it through even if it killed me. About 3 hours into the flight, I started having engine problems. Nothing dramatic, just a slight roughness in the power delivery and occasional fluctuations in the fuel flow indicator. In normal conditions, these would have been minor issues that I could have addressed after landing. But at negative 20 degrees and 200 miles from the nearest airport, even minor problems could become fatal. I tried adjusting the mixture and checking all the engine parameters, but the roughness persisted. The fuel lines were probably developing ice crystals despite the additives I'd mixed in. The oil was thickening as the temperature dropped. The spark plugs were fouling from the rich mixture I was running to compensate for the cold air. Most critically, I was burning fuel faster than my calculations had predicted. The engine was working harder in the dense cold air, and the constant small corrections I was making to deal with turbulence were adding to my fuel consumption. By my revised estimates, I might not have enough fuel to reach San Antonio. I started looking for alternative landing sites, but the options were limited. Most of the small airports below were probably unusable due to ice and snow accumulation. The highways were too rough and debris covered for a safe emergency landing. And landing in a field in these conditions would probably mean freezing to death before I could find shelter. The radio traffic was getting more desperate as I flew further south. I started hearing transmissions from Houston, where a ham radio operator was giving regular weather reports. He said the temperature there was 20 degrees above zero, which would have been unprecedented for Houston in November, but sounded tropical compared to what I'd been experiencing in Colorado. But even more disturbing were his reports about infrastructure failures. The power grid in Houston was failing as demand for heating overwhelmed the generating capacity. The ports were having problems with ice forming in areas where ice had never been seen before. The refineries were shutting down because their equipment wasn't designed to operate in these temperatures. If Houston was having these kinds of problems, what did that mean for San Antonio? And what did it mean for the rest of the country? Were we looking at a complete collapse of industrial civilization, or just a temporary crisis that would resolve itself when the volcanic ash settled out of the atmosphere? 4 hours into the flight, I was definitely in trouble. The engine roughness was getting worse, and I was now certain that I didn't have enough fuel to reach San Antonio. I needed to find a place to land, and I needed to find it soon, before the engine quit entirely or I ran out of fuel over empty countryside. I started scanning for any kind of airfield or suitable landing area. Most of the airports I could see on my sectional charts were small grass strips that were probably buried under snow. But I spotted what looked like a paved runway at a small airport outside Amarillo. It wasn't much, but it was better than trying to land on a highway or in a field. I changed course toward the airport and started my descent, monitoring the engine carefully for any signs of imminent failure. The power was still there, but it was increasingly uneven, and I could tell that I was running on borrowed time. If the engine quit before I could get on the ground, I'd be making a dead stick landing in terrain that offered very few good options. The airport looked abandoned from the air, with no signs of recent activity and snow covering most of the surfaces. But the runway appeared to be clear enough for landing, probably because the wind had blown most of the snow into drifts along the edges. I lined up for final approach and started my descent, knowing that this might be the last landing I ever made. The touchdown was harder than I would have liked, but the Cherokee rolled out safely, and I managed to taxi toward what looked like a small terminal building. As I shut down the engine, I could hear it making sounds that suggested serious internal problems. Whether from ice in the fuel system or oil that had thickened beyond safe limits, my aircraft was telling me that it needed major maintenance before it could fly again. I climbed out of the cockpit and immediately understood how much trouble I was in. The wind was brutal, cutting through my flight jacket like it wasn't there. The temperature had to be at least -20 degrees, cold enough that I could feel my exposed skin starting to numb within seconds. The airport was completely deserted, with no signs that anyone had been there in weeks. The terminal building was locked, but I managed to find a window that had been broken by ice and climbed inside. It wasn't much warmer than outside, but at least it offered some protection from the wind. I spent the rest of that day trying to assess my situation and figure out what to do next. My Cherokee was probably not going to fly again without major repairs that I couldn't perform with the tools and parts I had available. I was still 350 miles from San Antonio, too far to walk in these conditions, and I had no way to contact my family or anyone else who might be able to help. But I was alive, which was more than I could say for a lot of people. I had survival gear, emergency food supplies, and enough aviation fuel to keep a small heater running for several days. I'd found shelter that would protect me from the worst of the weather. And maybe, if I was lucky and resourceful, I could find a way to get my aircraft running again. That first night, sleeping in what had been the airport's waiting area, I listened to the radio chatter from the few remaining ham operators across the region. The reports were getting worse by the hour, cities going dark one by one, communication systems failing, supply chains completely broken down, but I also heard something that gave me hope. A radio operator in Austin was still broadcasting, reporting that Central Texas was cold but not frozen, that some services were still functioning, that people were still alive and trying to maintain some kind of civilization. If Austin was still functioning, maybe San Antonio was too. Maybe my family was still alive, waiting for me to somehow find a way to cover those last 350 miles. Maybe this wasn't the end of everything, just an interruption that could be overcome with enough determination and luck. I spent the next several days working on my aircraft, trying to diagnose and fix the engine problems that had forced me down. I found some tools in the airport maintenance shop and managed to drain fuel lines that had ice crystals in them. I changed the spark plugs using spares from my emergency kit. I thinned the oil with additives to help it flow better in the extreme cold. But the more I worked on the engine, the more I realized that the problems went beyond simple cold weather issues. The fuel injection system was damaged, probably from ice crystals that had formed despite my precautions. The electrical system was having intermittent failures, and most critically, I was running low on the aviation fuel I needed to test any repairs. During those days, I also explored the surrounding area, looking for supplies and trying to understand what had happened to the local population. Amarillo had been a city of 200,000 people, but now it looked like a ghost town. Most of the buildings were dark and apparently empty. The few signs of recent activity were mostly related to people trying to stay warm by burning whatever they could find. I found abandoned vehicles along the highways, their occupants probably having died from exposure or having continued south on foot. I found houses where families had obviously tried to wait out the crisis, burning furniture and books and anything else combustible to keep warm until their fuel ran out and the cold claimed them. Most disturbing, I found evidence of the violence that Maria had mentioned during our last conversation. Buildings that had been broken into and ransacked. Signs of desperate conflicts over the remaining food and fuel supplies. The breakdown of law and order that happens when survival becomes more important than civilization. But I also found resources that helped me survive. Canned food in abandoned stores. Clothing and blankets in empty houses. Most importantly, I found a cache of tools and automotive supplies that might help me repair my aircraft if I could figure out how to adapt car parts for aviation use. A week after my emergency landing, I was still working on getting my Cherokee airworthy again, but I was starting to face the reality that it might not be possible. The damage was too extensive, the conditions too harsh, and my resources too limited. I might be stuck in Amarillo indefinitely, slowly using up my supplies while waiting for either rescue that would never come or spring that might never arrive. That's when I started seriously considering the possibility of continuing south on foot. 350 miles was a long way to walk, especially in these conditions, but people were doing it. I'd seen the refugee streams from the air, thousands of people who had made the same calculation, and decided that movement was better than staying in place to die. But I also knew that most of those refugees weren't going to make it to their destinations. Walking hundreds of miles in sub-zero temperatures, carrying only what you could fit in a backpack, was essentially suicide unless you had extraordinary luck with weather and supplies. And even if you survived the journey, there was no guarantee that your destination would be any better than where you started. I continued monitoring the radio frequencies, listening for any information that might help me make decisions about what to do next. The ham radio network was slowly going quiet as operators either died or gave up trying to maintain contact. But there were still occasional voices, people sharing information about conditions in various parts of the country. The most encouraging reports were still coming from Central Texas, where some communities were apparently managing to maintain basic services despite the unprecedented cold. But even those reports were becoming less frequent and more desperate as time went on. 2 weeks after landing in Amarillo, I finally got my Cherokee's engine running again. It wasn't perfect, and it probably wouldn't last for a long flight, but it was producing power and all the systems seemed to be functioning. I had enough fuel for maybe one more attempt to reach San Antonio, but it would have to be soon before the weather got even worse or my improvised repairs failed. I spent that night doing final preparations, loading the last of my supplies and plotting a course that would take me directly over the Texas Hill Country to San Antonio. If everything went perfectly, I might have just enough fuel to make it. If anything went wrong, I'd be making another emergency landing in country that was even less hospitable than where I'd been stranded. But staying in Amarillo wasn't really an option anymore. My supplies were running low, the weather was getting worse, and I hadn't heard any radio traffic from my family or anyone else in San Antonio for over a week. If I was going to find out whether they were still alive, I needed to make this flight work. As I prepared for what might be my final takeoff, I realized that I'd already survived longer than most people in this new world we were living in. I'd made it out of Denver when thousands of others hadn't. I'd flown hundreds of miles through conditions that should have been impossible. I'd managed to repair my aircraft with improvised tools and parts that weren't designed for the job. But none of that would matter if I couldn't cover those last 350 miles to reach my family. Everything I'd done, every risk I'd taken, every person I'd left behind, would be meaningless if I died somewhere over the frozen Texas landscape without ever knowing whether Maria and her kids had survived. Tomorrow morning, I was going to find out whether a pilot's determination and a small aircraft's reliability were enough to bridge the gap between disaster and reunion. Whether the skills that had kept me alive so far were sufficient to carry me through one more flight into an uncertain future. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and the odds couldn't have been worse. But I was going to try, because that's what you do when everything else has been taken away, and the only thing left is the hope that somewhere ahead, the people you love are still waiting for you to come home. Waking up in that cockpit after my emergency landing in Amarillo, I could see my breath inside the plane even though I'd been running a small heater all night. Outside, the city that had once been home to 200,000 people looked like something from another planet. Snow had drifted against buildings until they were half buried. Streets were impassable canyons of white, and there wasn't a single light visible anywhere, not even the flicker of fires that might indicate someone was still alive and trying to stay warm. That McDonald's I mentioned earlier became my base of operations for the next month. It still had most of its roof intact, four walls that offered some protection from the wind, and enough space for me to work on my aircraft when the weather permitted. The kitchen equipment was useless without power, but the dining area had booth seating that I could arrange into a makeshift bed, and the storage areas contained supplies that previous occupants had either overlooked or abandoned. Those first few days in Amarillo, I developed a survival routine that kept me alive when staying in one place too long would have meant death. Every morning at dawn, I'd check the weather and radio frequencies for any information that might help me make decisions about what to do next. Then I'd spend several hours working on my Cherokee, trying to diagnose and repair the engine problems that had forced me down. The aircraft was telling me a story I didn't want to hear. The fuel injection system had been damaged by ice crystals that had formed despite all my precautions. The electrical system was having intermittent failures that suggested cold-related damage to wiring and connections. Most critically, the engine was burning oil at a rate that meant it probably wouldn't last for another long flight even if I could get it running reliably. But I kept working on it anyway, because giving up meant accepting that I'd spend the rest of my life in a frozen McDonald's in Texas, slowly using up my supplies while waiting for either rescue that would never come or spring that might never arrive. I found tools in the airport maintenance shop and learned to improvise repairs using automotive parts that weren't designed for aircraft, but might work well enough to get me airborne one more time. The radio became my lifeline to the outside world, though the news it brought was almost universally bad. The ham radio network that had been the only reliable communication system was slowly going quiet as operators either died from the cold or gave up trying to maintain contact with a world that was falling apart faster than anyone could document. But there were still voices out there, people sharing information about conditions in various parts of the country, and trying to coordinate what little remained of organized relief efforts. I learned that most of the major cities in the northern states had been completely abandoned, or had populations so reduced that they no longer functioned as urban areas. Chicago was reporting fewer than 50,000 people still in the city, down from nearly 3 million before the eruption. Detroit had been evacuated entirely after the power grid failed and water systems froze. Even cities as far south as St. Louis and Louisville were describing conditions that sounded like the end of civilization. The most encouraging reports were still coming from Central Texas, where some communities were apparently managing to maintain basic services despite temperatures that would have been unprecedented for the region in normal times. Austin was still broadcasting irregular weather reports. Houston was still trying to coordinate refugee assistance, though their resources were becoming increasingly strained. But what really kept me going during those long, cold days was the possibility that San Antonio might still be functioning. The radio reports from that area were sporadic and often contradictory, but they suggested that parts of South Texas were still inhabited and that some infrastructure was still working. I calculated the distance from Amarillo to San Antonio probably 100 times during those weeks. 350 miles as the crow flies. maybe 400 miles if I had to deviate around weather or navigate by landmarks instead of GPS. With my Cherokee running perfectly and no headwinds, it was a flight I could complete in about 3 hours. But my Cherokee wasn't running perfectly, and perfect weather conditions seemed to be a thing of the past. Every day I delayed increased the chances that some critical component would fail, or that the weather would deteriorate beyond the point where flight was possible. But every day I left too early increased the chances that I'd end up making an emergency landing in terrain that offered even fewer survival options than Amarillo. About 2 weeks after my arrival, I had a breakthrough with the aircraft repairs. I managed to bypass the damaged fuel injection system using components from a car I found in the airport parking lot. The modification wasn't pretty, and it wouldn't last for very long, but it might get me to San Antonio if I could keep the engine running smoothly enough to complete the flight. That same day, I heard something on the radio that changed everything. A ham operator in Houston was broadcasting a regular schedule of weather reports and emergency information, and he mentioned that he'd been in contact with operators in San Antonio as recently as the previous week. They were reporting difficult conditions, but confirmed that parts of the city were still inhabited and that some services were still functioning. More importantly, he said that San Antonio was serving as a gathering point for refugees from across Texas and the surrounding states. People were streaming in from the north, looking for somewhere warm enough to survive the winter. The city was struggling to handle the influx, but it was still accepting refugees and trying to provide basic shelter and food. That night, I made the decision to attempt one more flight. I'd been in Amarillo for 2 weeks. My supplies were running low, and the weather reports suggested that conditions were only going to get worse as winter deepened. If I was going to reach my family, it had to be soon, before my improvised repairs failed or the last of the functioning communities in Texas collapsed under the strain of supporting too many displaced people. I spent the next 3 days preparing for what I knew would probably be my final flight. I loaded every piece of survival gear I could carry without overloading the aircraft. I studied weather patterns and radio reports, looking for any window of opportunity that might give me flyable conditions for the 3 to 4 hours I needed to reach San Antonio. Most critically, I managed to find additional aviation fuel by siphoning it from abandoned aircraft at the Amarillo airport. It wasn't much, maybe 20 gallons total, but it gave me enough range to reach my destination with a small reserve for navigation errors or unexpected headwinds. During those final days in Amarillo, I also started recording these messages, not just to document what had happened, but because I realized there was a good chance that nobody would ever hear my voice again after I took off. If the engine failed somewhere over the Texas plains, if I encountered weather that I couldn't handle, if I simply ran out of fuel short of my destination, these recordings might be the only evidence that Joaquin Rivera had tried to reach his family during the worst disaster in human history. The radio chatter during those days was becoming increasingly desperate. The few operators who were still broadcasting were reporting conditions that sounded like something from a post-apocalyptic movie. Entire regions going silent, government services completely collapsed, infrastructure failures that were cascading across multiple states simultaneously. But what really worried me was the silence from San Antonio. The ham operator in Houston was still broadcasting, but he mentioned that he hadn't heard from San Antonio in over a week. Either their radio equipment had failed, or atmospheric conditions were preventing communication, or something worse had happened that meant there was nobody left to broadcast. I tried not to think about what that silence might mean for Maria and her kids. Maybe their radio had broken down. Maybe they'd been forced to evacuate to somewhere else. Maybe they were still alive but unable to communicate for reasons that had nothing to do with their survival. But I also had to face the possibility that I was planning a dangerous flight to reach people who might no longer be alive. 3 weeks after landing in Amarillo, I finally got a weather report that sounded like it might give me the window I needed. A high-pressure system was moving in from the west, promising several hours of relatively clear conditions with light winds and no precipitation. It wouldn't be perfect flying weather, but it would be the best I was likely to see for weeks or months. I spent that night doing final preparations and going through pre-flight procedures that I'd normally complete in 30 minutes, but now took several hours because of the extreme cold and the improvised nature of my repairs. Every system had to be checked multiple times. Every component had to be evaluated for cold weather reliability. Every calculation had to account for conditions that were far outside normal operating parameters. The engine start the next morning was the most nerve-wracking 30 seconds of my life. I'd been keeping a small fire burning under the engine block for 3 days, feeding it anything combustible I could find in the abandoned buildings around the airport. The oil was thick despite the additives I'd mixed in. The fuel lines were borderline freezing despite the antifreeze, and I knew that if the engine didn't start on the first few attempts, it probably never would. But she caught on the fourth try, coughing and missing for the first few minutes, but gradually settling into something resembling a normal idle. The engine monitor showed temperatures and pressures that were marginal but acceptable. All the systems I'd repaired or bypassed seemed to be functioning. After 3 weeks of uncertainty, my Cherokee was ready to fly again. The takeoff from that small airport outside Amarillo was probably the most difficult of my flying career. The runway was covered with a thin layer of ice that made it slippery but not quite impassable. The air was so cold and dense that the aircraft felt heavy and sluggish, requiring a longer takeoff roll than normal. And I knew that if something went wrong during those first few minutes of flight, I'd be making an emergency landing in terrain that offered very few good options. But we got airborne, and I began climbing slowly toward my cruising altitude while monitoring every gauge and listening to every sound the engine made. The power was there, but it was uneven and unpredictable. The fuel flow was adequate but not optimal, and I could tell that I was operating on borrowed time, flying an aircraft that was held together by improvised repairs and determination. As I turned southeast toward San Antonio, I tried to calculate fuel consumption and flight time based on the conditions I was actually experiencing, rather than the theoretical performance I'd planned for. The engine was working harder than normal in the dense cold air. The headwinds were stronger than forecast, and I was burning fuel at a rate that meant I'd arrive at my destination with almost no reserves. The landscape below told the story of a civilization that had collapsed faster than anyone thought possible. Cities that should have been thriving communities were dark and apparently abandoned. Highways that should have been busy with traffic were empty, except for scattered abandoned vehicles buried under snow. Rivers that should have been flowing were frozen solid, looking like highways made of ice stretching across the Texas plains. About an hour into the flight, I started picking up radio transmissions from what sounded like military or emergency services frequencies. The voices were professional and calm, but the content was devastating. They were coordinating relief efforts for cities that no longer existed. They were trying to establish communication with communities that had gone silent weeks earlier. They were documenting the complete breakdown of infrastructure across multiple states. One transmission that particularly stayed with me was from a pilot who was reporting conditions in Dallas. He said the city was completely dark with no signs of life or activity. The airports were unusable due to ice damage. The highways were impassable, and there were no responses to radio calls on any frequency. Dallas, with a metropolitan population of over 7 million people, had apparently ceased to exist as a functioning urban area. If Dallas was gone, what did that mean for smaller cities like San Antonio? And what did it mean for families like mine who had been depending on urban infrastructure to survive this crisis? I tried not to think about the implications, but the silence from San Antonio was becoming harder to ignore as I flew further south. 2 hours into the flight, I was definitely having engine problems again. The power fluctuations were getting worse, and I could see oil temperature rising beyond normal limits. The improvised repairs I'd made in Amarillo were starting to fail, and I knew that I probably had minutes rather than hours before something critical gave out completely. I started looking for emergency landing sites, but the options were even more limited than they'd been during my first emergency. Most of the small airports I could identify were probably buried under snow and ice. The highways were too rough and debris covered for a safe landing, and putting down in a field in these conditions would probably mean dying of exposure before I could find adequate shelter. But I also knew that I was getting close to my destination. San Antonio was maybe 50 miles ahead, and I could see what looked like the distinctive pattern of urban development on the horizon. If I could keep the engine running for just 30 more minutes, I might be able to complete the flight that had started 6 weeks earlier when I'd taken off from Denver International Airport. The radio frequency for San Antonio approach control was completely silent, which wasn't surprising given that most air traffic control facilities had been shut down weeks earlier. But I tried calling anyway, hoping that someone might be monitoring the emergency frequencies and could provide information about current conditions in the city. Instead of getting a response from air traffic control, I heard something that gave me both hope and concern. A weak transmission from what sounded like a ham radio operator somewhere in the San Antonio area. He was calling for anyone with medical training to respond to an emergency at what he called the refugee center downtown. The transmission was broken and hard to understand, but it confirmed that there were still people alive in San Antonio and that some kind of organized assistance was still being provided. But it also suggested that the city was dealing with a refugee crisis that was overwhelming whatever resources remained. If San Antonio was struggling to provide basic services to the people who were already there, what did that mean for one more refugee arriving by aircraft with no fuel reserves and limited survival supplies? 25 miles from San Antonio, the engine started making sounds that I'd never heard before. Metallic grinding noises that suggested internal components were failing, oil pressure dropping rapidly, fuel flow becoming increasingly erratic. All the warning signs that pilots are trained to recognize as indications of imminent engine failure. I pushed the mixture control to full rich and tried to squeeze every last minute of operation out of an engine that was clearly dying. The power was still there, but it was decreasing rapidly and becoming more unstable with every passing minute. I needed to find a place to land immediately, before the engine quit entirely and left me with no options except a dead stick landing in hostile terrain. That's when I spotted what looked like a straight section of farm road that might be clear enough for an emergency landing. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than trying to stretch my glide range to reach an airport that might not be usable anyway. I started my descent toward what I hoped would be my final landing, knowing that my Cherokee had brought me as far as she could, and that the rest of the journey would have to be completed on foot. The landing was harder than anything I'd ever attempted, putting the aircraft down on a road that was partially covered with ice and debris. But we stayed on the surface and rolled to a stop without major damage, though I could tell from the engine sounds that my flying days were definitely over. Whatever had been holding the power plant together during those last 50 miles had finally given up. As I shut down the engine for what would probably be the last time, I realized that I was now just 2 miles from Maria's neighborhood. After 6 weeks of travel, after flying over 1,000 miles through impossible conditions, after surviving crashes and equipment failures and weather that should have killed me, I was finally close enough to my family that I could reach them on foot. But I also realized that the hardest part of my journey might still be ahead of me. 2 miles might not sound like much, but in -20-degree weather with limited survival gear, it could easily be far enough to kill me if I made any mistakes or encountered any unexpected obstacles. The next few hours would determine whether this entire desperate journey had been worth the risks I'd taken and the people I'd left behind, whether I'd find my family alive and safe, or whether I'd discover that I'd spent 6 weeks traveling toward a destination that no longer offered any hope for survival. Tomorrow morning, I would find out whether a pilot's determination and a small aircraft's reliability had been enough to bridge the gap between disaster and reunion, whether everything I'd sacrificed and everyone I'd abandoned had been justified by the possibility of holding my sister and her children one more time before the world finished ending around us. Day 78. This is it. The weather forecast from a barely functioning station in Oklahoma said temperatures might rise to -10 degrees. For this new world we're living in, that's practically tropical. I've been keeping a small fire burning under my Cherokee's engine block for 3 days straight, feeding it anything that would combust. Chairs from the McDonald's, old magazines, pieces of cardboard, even pages from the flight manuals I'd carried with me from Denver. The methanol antifreeze solution I'd been mixing into the fuel system was my last hope for getting the engine to turn over in these conditions. I'd found bottles of HEET at an abandoned truck stop, mixed it with isopropyl alcohol, even added some moonshine I'd discovered hidden behind a false wall in the airport office. Anything to keep the fuel flowing through lines that wanted to freeze solid at these temperatures. My hands were shaking as I went through the pre-flight inspection, not just from the cold, but from the knowledge that this was probably my last chance. If the engine didn't start this morning, if I couldn't get airborne and cover those remaining 350 miles to San Antonio, then everything I'd done over the past 6 weeks would have been for nothing. The Cherokee looked tired and beaten down, covered with ice and scarred from the emergency landing in Amarillo. But she'd brought me this far through conditions that should have killed us both. I owed it to her and to myself to try one more time, even if the odds of success were minimal and the chance of survival even smaller. On the 7th attempt, she caught. Not smooth, not pretty, but that Lycoming engine was turning over and producing power. The engine monitor showed temperatures and pressures that were marginal at best, but everything was within acceptable limits for a desperate pilot willing to take risks that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. I didn't waste time with extended warm-up procedures or careful system checks. I knew the engine was barely holding together, and every minute I delayed increased the chance that something critical would fail before I could get airborne. I taxied to the runway, did a quick run-up to check the basics, and lined up for takeoff on a strip of pavement that was covered with ice but still usable. The takeoff roll felt endless. The aircraft was heavy with survival gear and emergency supplies. The air was so dense that the wings struggled to develop lift, and I could feel the engine fighting against conditions it was never designed to handle. But we got airborne, climbing slowly through air that felt thick as molasses, while I monitored every gauge and listened to every sound the power plant made. As I turned southeast towards San Antonio, I started doing fuel calculations that had become a matter of life and death. The engine was burning fuel faster than normal because of the cold air density. The headwinds were stronger than forecast, and my improvised repairs were creating additional drag that reduced my aircraft's efficiency. By my best estimates, I'd arrive at San Antonio with maybe 10 minutes of fuel remaining, assuming nothing went wrong during the flight. The landscape below told a story that I was finally beginning to understand in its full scope. This wasn't just a weather emergency or a temporary crisis that would resolve itself when spring arrived. This was the end of industrial civilization as we'd known it. The infrastructure that supported 300 million Americans had simply stopped functioning when the temperature dropped below the limits that engineers had designed for. Flying over what used to be Oklahoma, I could see the Red River completely frozen from bank to bank. Towns that should have been there were just white spaces on the landscape, buried under snow drifts that made them invisible from the air. The interstate highways looked like white ribbons stretched across empty country, marked only by the occasional dark spot that was probably an abandoned vehicle. About an hour into the flight, I started picking up radio transmissions from emergency frequencies that were still active. Military pilots were coordinating relief flights to cities that might or might not still exist. Ham radio operators were sharing information about refugee movements and survival conditions. Emergency services were trying to maintain contact with communities that were going silent one by one. But what struck me most was how professional and calm everyone sounded, even as they described conditions that represented the complete breakdown of everything we'd built over the past century. These were people who had accepted that the world they'd known was gone forever, and they were focused on documenting what remained and helping whoever they could while there was still time. The most encouraging transmissions were still coming from Central Texas, where some communities apparently had enough resources and infrastructure to maintain basic services. Austin was still broadcasting weather reports. Houston was still trying to coordinate refugee assistance. And occasionally, I'd hear fragments of communication from the San Antonio area that suggested people were still alive there and still trying to maintain some kind of organized response to the crisis. 2 hours into the flight, I was definitely having serious engine problems. The oil pressure was fluctuating wildly. The engine temperature was climbing beyond safe limits. The power output was becoming increasingly erratic, and I could hear metallic sounds that suggested internal components were starting to fail. I started looking for emergency landing options, but the terrain below offered very few good choices. Most of the small airports were buried under snow. The highways were too rough and debris-covered for a safe landing, and putting down in a field would probably mean freezing to death before I could find shelter, even if I survived the landing itself. But I was also getting close to my destination. San Antonio was maybe 50 miles ahead, and I could see what looked like the urban heat island effect on the horizon, a slight haze that suggested there might still be enough activity in the city to generate some warmth. If I could keep the engine running for just 30 more minutes, I might actually complete this impossible journey. That's when I heard something on the radio that changed everything. A weak transmission from what sounded like a ham operator somewhere in the San Antonio area. The signal was broken and hard to understand, but I caught enough to know that there were still people alive in the city, and that some kind of refugee assistance was still being provided. The operator was calling for medical assistance at what he described as a downtown emergency shelter. He mentioned that they were dealing with hundreds of refugees who had walked in from the north, many of them suffering from frostbite and exposure-related injuries. The transmission suggested that San Antonio was still functioning as a destination for displaced people, but that resources were being stretched beyond their limits. 25 miles from San Antonio, the engine started making sounds that I'd never heard before in 15 years of flying. Deep grinding noises that meant internal bearings were failing. Oil pressure dropping towards zero. Fuel flow becoming so erratic that the engine was missing and surging unpredictably. I pushed the mixture to full rich and tried to squeeze every last minute of operation out of machinery that was clearly at the end of its operational life. The power was still there, but it was decreasing rapidly, and I knew that complete engine failure was probably only minutes away. That's when I spotted a straight section of farm road that looked clear enough for an emergency landing. It wasn't ideal, but it was my only option short of trying to stretch my glide range to reach an airport that might not be usable anyway. I started my descent, knowing that this would probably be the last landing my Cherokee would ever make. The touchdown was the hardest of my flying career. I put the aircraft down on pavement that was partially covered with ice and debris, hitting harder than I'd ever landed anything but managing to keep it on the surface and roll to a stop without major structural damage. As I shut down the engine, I could hear it making sounds that confirmed my flying days were over. Whatever had been holding the power plant together during those final miles had finally given up completely. I climbed out of the cockpit and immediately understood how close I'd come to not making it this far. The wind was brutal, cutting through my flight jacket like it wasn't there. The temperature had to be at least -20 degrees, cold enough that I could feel exposed skin starting to numb within seconds of being outside. But I was also closer to my family than I'd been in 6 weeks. According to my calculations, Maria's house was less than 2 miles away. After flying over 1,000 miles through impossible conditions, after surviving equipment failures and whether that should have killed me, I was finally close enough to reach my destination on foot. I loaded my survival pack with emergency supplies and started walking southeast toward the subdivision where my sister lived. The road was treacherous, covered with ice and partially blocked by snow drifts, but it was passable for someone on foot who was careful about where they stepped. The landscape around San Antonio looked different from what I remembered. Snow covered everything, which was unprecedented for this part of Texas. But more disturbing was the silence. There was no traffic, no aircraft overhead, no sounds of urban activity. Just the wind and the crunch of my boots on frozen pavement. About a mile into the walk, I started seeing signs of recent human activity. Footprints in the snow, mostly heading south toward the city center. Abandoned vehicles that had been picked clean of anything useful. And occasionally, dark stains on the snow that I didn't want to think about too carefully. I also started seeing evidence of the refugee crisis that the radio operator had mentioned. Makeshift shelters constructed from tarps and debris along the roadside. The remains of campfires where people had tried to stay warm during their journey south. And in a few places, graves marked with simple crosses that suggested not everyone who had attempted this walk had completed it successfully. As I got closer to Maria's neighborhood, I started recognizing landmarks that I remembered from previous visits. The gas station where we'd always stopped for supplies. The elementary school where her kids had attended classes. The park where we'd had family barbecues during happier times when the world still made sense. But everything looked different now, transformed by snow and ice and the absence of normal human activity. The gas station was dark and apparently abandoned. The school was buried under drifts that reached the second-floor windows. The park was an unmarked expanse of white that gave no hint of the playground equipment buried somewhere beneath. When I finally reached Maria Street, I could see smoke rising from a few chimneys, which gave me hope that at least some people were still alive and trying to maintain basic survival conditions. But most of the houses looked dark and empty, their windows boarded up or broken, their driveways filled with snow that showed no recent tire tracks. Maria's house was in the middle of the block, a modest 2-story structure with a small front yard that I'd helped her landscape 3 years earlier. As I approached, I could see that someone had boarded up most of the ground floor windows, probably to conserve heat and provide better insulation against the unprecedented cold. But there was smoke coming from the chimney, which meant someone was inside and had access to fuel for heating. I walked up to the front door and knocked, calling out my name and explaining that I was Maria's brother. For several minutes, there was no response, and I started to worry that whoever was inside might be too sick or weak to answer. Then I heard footsteps and the sound of someone removing boards that had been nailed across the door from the inside. When the door finally opened, I was looking at my sister for the first time in over a year, but she looked like she'd aged a decade in the 6 weeks since the eruption. Maria was thin, much thinner than I remembered, and her face showed the strain of trying to keep her family alive under impossible conditions. But she was alive, and when she saw me standing on her doorstep, her expression changed from suspicion to recognition to relief so intense that she started crying before she could say my name. Her kids were alive too, though they looked as malnourished and stressed as their mother. They'd been surviving on canned goods and whatever food they'd managed to stockpile before the crisis hit. They were burning furniture and books to keep warm, rationing their heating oil to make it last as long as possible. But they were alive, and they'd been hoping that somehow I'd find a way to reach them. Maria told me that she'd been monitoring the emergency radio frequencies every day, listening for any sign that I'd made it out of Denver and was trying to get south. She'd heard reports about aircraft attempting long-distance flights in impossible conditions, and she'd hoped that one of those pilots might be her brother. I spent the rest of that day sharing my story and learning about what life had been like in San Antonio during the 6 weeks I'd been traveling. The city was still functioning, but barely. Municipal services had been reduced to essential emergency response only. The power grid was operating on a drastically reduced basis, with electricity available only a few hours each day. More critically, San Antonio had become a destination for refugees from across Texas and the surrounding states. Thousands of people had walked hundreds of miles to reach what they hoped would be a warmer and safer place to wait out the crisis. The city was trying to provide basic shelter and food assistance, but resources were being stretched beyond their limits. Maria told me about the emergency shelters that had been set up in schools and community centers, where refugees were sleeping on gymnasium floors and sharing whatever food could be distributed. She described the medical crisis that was developing as people arrived suffering from frostbite, exposure, and malnutrition after their desperate journey south. But she also told me about the sense of community that was developing among the survivors. People were sharing resources, helping to care for children and elderly refugees, organizing work teams to maintain essential services. It wasn't the world we'd lost, but it was something that might be sustainable if spring ever came and conditions improved. That night, sleeping in a real bed for the first time in 6 weeks, I tried to process everything that had happened since I'd taken off from Denver International Airport. I'd witnessed the complete collapse of American civilization. I'd flown over 1,000 miles through conditions that had killed thousands of other people. I'd survived equipment failures and weather emergencies that should have ended my journey before it really began. But I'd also discovered something about human resilience that I hadn't understood before the crisis started. People were capable of surviving conditions that seemed impossible. They were capable of helping each other even when resources were desperately scarce. They were capable of maintaining hope even when everything they'd known had been destroyed. Over the next few days, I started integrating into the survival community that had developed in San Antonio. I used my technical skills to help maintain the emergency radio networks that kept the city connected to other survivor communities. I shared information about conditions in other parts of the country based on what I'd observed during my flight south. Most importantly, I started helping to coordinate assistance for the refugees who were still arriving from the north. My experience as a pilot gave me knowledge about weather patterns and navigation that was useful for planning evacuation routes and supply distribution. My survival experience during the journey from Denver gave me insights about what people needed to stay alive during long-distance travel in extreme conditions. But I also had to accept some hard realities about the world we were now living in. The radio reports from other parts of the country made it clear that this wasn't a temporary crisis that would resolve itself when the volcanic ash settled out of the atmosphere. The climate had changed permanently, at least for the foreseeable future. Entire regions had become uninhabitable. Millions of people had died, and millions more were still at risk. The government, what remained of it, was focused on maintaining basic services in a few major cities that still had adequate resources and infrastructure. Most of the country was now essentially ungoverned territory, where survival depended on local cooperation and mutual aid rather than institutional support. 2 weeks after reaching San Antonio, I heard news that made me understand just how lucky I'd been to complete my journey when I did. The ham radio operator in Houston, who had been broadcasting regular weather reports throughout my travels, had gone silent. His last transmission mentioned ice storms and infrastructure failures that were making conditions impossible, even in areas that had seemed relatively stable. Austin stopped broadcasting a few days later. Then Dallas went silent, though that had been expected since the city had essentially been abandoned weeks earlier. One by one, the radio voices that had been documenting the disaster were disappearing, either because their equipment had failed, or because the operators had died, or because atmospheric conditions were making long-distance communication impossible. But San Antonio was still functioning, and the emergency shelter system was still providing basic assistance to refugees who continued arriving from the north. It wasn't the life any of us had planned or expected, but it was life, and that was more than most Americans could say during the winter of 2024. A month after my arrival, I started making regular broadcasts on the emergency frequencies, sharing information about conditions in South Texas, and trying to maintain contact with other survivor communities. It was during one of these broadcasts that I started recording the messages you're hearing now, because I realized that someone needed to document what had really happened during those first 90 days when the world ended. These recordings are my attempt to preserve the story of how ordinary people responded to an extraordinary crisis, how a commercial pilot became a refugee, how a family reunion required flying 1,000 miles through impossible conditions, how communities formed and survived when everything else collapsed. If you're listening to this, you're alive, and that makes you one of the fortunate ones. Millions of people didn't survive the first 90 days of the Ice Age that started with the Yellowstone eruption, but millions of others did survive, and they're rebuilding something that might eventually become a new kind of civilization. I was a pilot in a world that no longer needed pilots, but I kept flying until there was nowhere left to fly. I found my family, and we're still alive, still trying to make sense of a world that changed faster than anyone thought possible. Maybe somewhere, spring is coming. Maybe somewhere, people are rebuilding the infrastructure that we lost. Maybe these recordings will help someone understand what we lost, and why it mattered, and how much we were willing to sacrifice for the people we loved. This is Captain Joaquin Rivera, documenting the end of one world and the beginning of whatever comes next. The battery on this recorder is almost dead, like everything else from the old world. Tomorrow, I start walking again, not looking for somewhere warm, but looking for proof that humanity survived, and that hope still exists somewhere in this frozen landscape that used to be America. If you find this recorder, if you find these recordings, remember us. Remember what we built, what we lost, and what we were willing to sacrifice for the people we loved. Remember that when everything else was taken away, the only thing that mattered was getting home to family, and that some of us made it, against odds that should have been impossible. Remember that pilots kept flying until there was nowhere left to fly, and that love was stronger than ice, and that even in the worst disaster in human history, people helped each other survive. Remember that the world ended not with bombs or invasions, but with cold and darkness, and the simple realization that everything we built was more fragile than we ever imagined. But also remember that we didn't give up. We kept trying, kept moving, kept hoping until the very end. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all anyone can ask for when the world ends and you have to find a way to keep living in whatever comes after.